Many of those recruits are unwitting. They think they're going to one place and then they end up in an assault force, which means that their life expectancy is dramatically shortened. But the Russians seem to be able to maintain this. They are compensating for the fact that they've run short of armor and armored vehicles by using, e-scooters, motorbikes, bicycles, walking, anything that can get individuals further forward. But they're still taking these tremendous casualties, killed and wounded, of maybe 1,000 a day. So a little bit down from the heights earlier on in the summer, but not a negligible number of casualties.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Matthew Savill, the Director of Military Sciences at the think tank RUSI. Matthew was also on the UK government's Operations and Crisis team in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Well, we are talking not long after these strikes on Kiev, some of the biggest since July. A British council building and the EU Commission offices have been hit. Is it possible that is some form of targeted strike, given the discussion of European security guarantees in the last week?
It's always possible. The Russians obviously have talked about Western influence and regard it as a pernicious influence, and you wouldn't be surprised to see them going after some of these locations and EU locations as well as a message or a warning. It's probably a bit early to speculate exactly what they were aiming at. There can always be mistakes made. I think the big thing is, though, none of these are really serious military targets, and the Russians, of course, always claim they're going after military targets, but we know what they're actually doing in many cases is going after civilian targets and critical infrastructure as part of Russian doctrine to increase the pressure on the Ukrainian government and generally, if you like, undermine domestic morale and support for the war.
And to the nature of these continuing and deepening strikes that the Russians are making on the Ukrainian civilian population largely, are they having any success, do you think? What's the nature of it? And is there any sign that this is actually having the impact that the Russians want, of sort of bombing the Ukrainians into submission almost?
I mean, that's genuinely very difficult to know, partly because it requires an assessment at a moment in time, and it also would understand a very, very detailed appreciation of Ukrainian domestic opinion and polling and all of those sort of things. You can see in polling that has been conducted in Ukraine that there is, if you like, an increase in support for some kind of negotiation and a recognition that many of their ambitions and aspirations that they've been looking for aren't going to be met. But at the same time, what you don't see is a collapse in domestic support for continuing the fight, because this is an existential one for them. And a lot of the criticism that you've seen of the Ukrainian government is actually about how they're handling domestic politics more than it is about whether or not they resist Russia. I think what we should be looking out, though, for is an intensification of attacks on those classic targets of critical infrastructure, energy generation, power, particularly as we move through autumn and into the winter again, because that does begin to hurt people if there are rolling power blackouts and people can't heat themselves as it gets colder. That inevitably has some kind of impact on morale, even though the Ukrainians have proven themselves time and again to be pretty resilient.
And elsewhere on the ground in this war, we've heard about Russian advances continuing in Dnipropetrovsk. What's the extent of the advances there, and do we know what the Russians are actually intending to capture in that region?
Very early days, and I'm always a bit wary of attempting to give a sort of current commentary on individual, fields and hamlets and small areas. But the general issue there is that the Russians are creeping forward. They are putting pressure along the full breadth of the line of contact, although we can talk about the fact that is increasingly becoming a blurred contact zone. The priority remains essentially the Donbass, particularly the rest of Donetsk, but further south, and particularly towards Zaporizhia, of course, they're looking at that and threatening into Dnipropetrovsk, and some of their efforts in places like Sumy and Kharkiv are about stretching the Ukrainians and beginning to look towards some of the more vulnerable kind of inner parts of the 80% of Ukraine that is still controlled by the Ukrainians. And so I don't think that has yet reached the level of extreme alarm, but they're being able to inch forward in other areas is part of this attempt to wear down Ukrainian defenses and probe for weak points and thinly defended areas.
And you mentioned Sumy there. I did want to ask a little bit about that area because we were hearing earlier in the month about Ukraine managing to retake smaller villages. I mean, has that area stabilized now, given that Russia's original general objective seemed to be to really push into Sumy, into the region of Sumy?
That feels more like one of these kind of distractions. It's a little bit of a response to the incursion into Kursk. And of course, if you remember, the Ukrainians originally framed some of that as forestalling a Russian advance into Sumy. I mean, it does seem like the Ukrainians have got that under control, but that never, or at least certainly didn't look like it was a major cause for concern. But it is another diversion of Ukrainian forces. They don't have huge reserves that they can move around the line. And it's just another area where they've got to keep an eye on what the Russians are doing with their more plentiful personnel numbers.
And speaking about those available reserve forces or even forces that can be moved from other areas of the front, we heard a lot about Pokrovsk ahead of the summit in Alaska. This, what some termed an offensive, others said was just a series of raids around that city. Um, it's now understood that the Ukrainians have managed to push back and stabilize that area as well. But what does it tell us about whether or not Ukraine is still able to move those troops around, bring in reserves to combat advances or attacks or focuses of intensity by the Russians?
I mean, it shows that those kind of forces still exist. What we don't know is what cost that came elsewhere. So, are there other areas that are now more thinly defended? It showed that they can react, and in this case, isolate, cut off, and essentially deal with what was obviously a concerning move. I'm not sure if it ever reached the point of a breakthrough. It certainly wasn't a breakout, i.e., where the Russians assemble a force and then to begin to maneuver behind the Ukrainian front lines. But it was an example that if the Russians push, there are weaker points to be found. I mean, what's happening in many cases that we understand now is that we don't have this idea of two opposing forces in trenches looking at each other across a no man's land. What we actually have is the intermingling of almost individual dugouts and foxholes and defensive positions, where the Russians are trying to infiltrate past the initial Ukrainian positions, which might be separated by hundreds of meters, and then dig in with whoever survives to then call in additional Russian personnel. These kind of attacks that consist of repeated small numbers of people who are dashing forwards, getting picked off, but trying to eke out a few extra meters. And that's why the Ukrainians are using the drone wall, because they just don't have these massed numbers. But it means identifying the front line in some cases is difficult because there isn't a line of contact. You have a zone of contact. And that means identifying what is an actual advance depends on whether or not the attacking force, mostly the Russians, consolidate that position. And that is a problem for the Ukrainians because it gives the Russians positions for which they can, if you like, threaten sideways. What they're trying to do is then attack the Ukrainians as they bring up their reserves, strike at their logistics. It's this constant battle over a few square meters that adds up to a few square kilometers over the course of a few days or a week.
And how costly is that sort of tactic that the Russians have employed to the Russian military and to their manpower?
I mean, it's enormously costly. It's a cost at the moment the Russians can recruit to sustain. The big unknown that many people are trying to work on, both the maths but also the insight into Russian mobilization, is for how long they can sustain that. It seems that they can still pay sufficient bonuses, although that's expensive, to attract recruits. I mean, many of those recruits are unwitting. They think they're going to one place and then they end up in an assault force, which means that their life expectancy is dramatically shortened. But the Russians seem to be able to maintain this. They are compensating for the fact that they've run short of armor and armored vehicles by using e-scooters, motorbikes, bicycles, walking, anything that can get individuals further forward. But they're still taking these tremendous casualties, killed and wounded, of maybe 1,000 a day. So a little bit down from the heights earlier on in the summer, but not a negligible number of casualties.
And we spoke a bit there about how Russia and Ukraine both strike at each other behind the lines and on the logistics that are feeding the front. We've now heard the US has approved initially a sale of possibly 3,350 ERAM guided bombs. What are those weapons? And is this a sort of action from the US that can kind of send a message to the Kremlin or help the Ukrainians on the front line?
It's proven quite difficult to read between the lines on US policy at the moment, because at the same time as that, we're seeing reports that the US has rescinded some of the freedoms that Ukrainians were given to use US supplied weapons to strike into Russia. And that was predominantly ATACMS, the small ballistic missile that goes off a HIMARS launcher, and also the rockets that are fired from HIMARS with varying ranges. So, maybe up to 70 kilometers for the short range stuff, 300 kilometers for the larger ones. So it's not clear what's actually happening in the US. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are far less reliant on those kind of weapons because they are increasingly developing their own. They've got a growing long-range strike drone campaign. In many cases, those are rudimentary cruise missiles, really. They're also developing their own classic cruise missiles. So it's possible that these weapons are more to help them in the fight inside Ukraine, close to the front line, trying to duplicate what the Russians do with their glide bombs. And that's one of the big differences between the two. Over and above the use of drones, is that the Russian use these very large weapons, which they can launch from tens of kilometers back and then turn away to escape Ukrainian air defenses, and then drop enormous, 1-ton bombs onto Ukrainian defended positions to demolish them, hit a headquarters, hit a fortified building. And that's what helps small groups of infantry break through then the lines.
Yeah, and what do we know about these new missiles the Ukrainians have developed? The Flamingo missile or the FP5. Is that something that is going to be helpful on the front line, or is that something that the Ukrainians would more want to use to strike oil pumping stations and infrastructure within Russia itself?
So the Flamingo is something that is much more useful for the deep strike campaign into Russia. And if it's to be believed, I mean, it looks like a big missile. It might have a range of something like 3,000 kilometers. I mean, that could be optimistic, but the point is that once it's beyond, say, 1,000, 1,500, there are a lot of quite attractive military industrial and industrial targets in range. I think some people have done some early analysis on the Flamingo, and it looks like an improvised weapon built up of a very large warhead from older weapons, something that looks a bit like a very large classic cruise missile. We'll need to see how it performs, and some of that performance will obviously be deliberately obscured. because it is big. It has a very large wingspan. It's probably not going to be supersonic, but it's not going to be as stealthy as something like a Storm Shadow or a Scalp. And how accurate is it? What is its guidance system? Although, big warhead compensates for some of that. So this has got a much longer range than those kind of Western supplied weapons, but there will be a challenge in guiding it onto its target, and how many will get shot down on the way in if it's that big and obvious. But it's another string to the Ukrainian bow. They've already proven themselves adept at stretching Russian air defenses. And one of the big things that's happening is they're really beginning to increase both the scale and the tempo of these deep strikes. And that will cause a series of dilemmas for the Russians in terms of where they put their air defenses, how they deal with attacks that might consist of, a lot of quite slow moving drones, but then a number of these cruise missiles. What it does seem to be happening is that increased tempo is now beginning to bite into elements of the Russian military industrial complex. I don't think we're yet seeing its impact on the front line, but there's been some really good analysis by people looking at the attacks on refineries, which suggests it is pushing up the price of petrol, gasoline, inside Russia to the extent that they're not exporting it anymore. That might increase the pressure on the home front, although I think we need to appreciate, again, the Russian system has been pretty good at suppressing or weathering domestic pressure.
Yes, and just before we started speaking today on Friday, there are reports coming out of Ukraine that they've struck a Russian oil pumping station in Bryansk. As you say, there does now seem to be an impact on the Russian economy. At what point does that sort of thing start to harm a war effort? And is it more the economic side of that has the impact? Or the political side, as you mentioned there, or is it possible that by restricting Russia's capability to create fuel itself, that can limit their ability to move things around, get things to the front?
I mean, this is a huge unknown because economies and governments, particularly authoritarian ones, can often be quite resilient for quite a long time in the face of external pressure. They get good at dealing with sanctions, they evade them, or they come up with alternatives inside. In the case of Russia, there are a range of targets here. So there is the direct military industrial targets, i.e., where do they make and store weapons? So where are the facilities making their complex long-range cruise missiles and ballistic missiles? Where are the facilities that make the Russian version of Iranian-supplied weapons? So they now have the Geran 2, which has been based on the Shahed. Can you damage or destroy those facilities so that there aren't as many of those weapons? So that's number one. Can you get at the source of their weapons? Stuff that's closer would be, where are they storing things that are directly on the way to the front? So can you really begin to eat into what's happening on the ground? That's proven difficult in the past because it's so varied and large and broad, but they did a good job, particularly early on, at hitting headquarters and storage sites. Then there is the big impact on the Russian economy in terms of oil production and export. And that hasn't made a huge dent yet, but it could do. And then there's this final one, which is actually internal, the internal economy and things, as I said, like gasoline, and how that affects the price at the pump in Russia. It's that one that seems to be experiencing the most significant effect now. But I honestly couldn't tell you whether or not that will actually begin to bite in such a way as that it changes the pressure on Putin himself, because that's quite a high threshold to hit. For example, it affects the Russian consumer, but are they actually going to come out to the streets and protest? You'd have to hit diesel to affect the Russian military system in terms of what they want as a customer. It's not clear that is happening yet. So these are the kind of things that do need to happen. Understanding their effect is an incredibly difficult art.
And you mentioned earlier the quite complex situation that we're reading coming out of the US on where they stand after the talks with Vladimir Putin and then European leaders. But following that, we did see a lot more movement in Europe, or discussion in Europe about those security guarantees, what shape they might take. Uh, Russia are very much opposed to the proposals we've seen so far. But is there any way for a European security force to enter Ukraine without a prior agreement from Russia or some sort of ceasefire brokered by the US?
I mean, it certainly could. It could decide that it's willing to take that risk, and the Europeans move in some kind of force. We can come back to what that could look like. The Ukrainians would, I'm sure, welcome an expanded presence in country. Obviously, there is a presence at the moment, which is largely a kind of liaison defence section. There's a small British medical training effort there. But the UK and others could, for example, move some of the external training into country. But if the war was still going on, they would need to defend that. They'd need to find the air defences to do that. And they would need to accept that they would be a target. And I think at the moment, the way that it's being talked about, it looks very much like a post ceasefire or post peace deal kind of force. And I think the problem there is the incentives for Russia aren't to agree to any kind of cessation of violence. So it's a bit of a hypothetical exercise at the moment.
Yeah, and you talk about what the Russians have demanded essentially in order to even start talking about the idea of halting the war. Before that Alaska summit, there was a lot of discussion about the idea of this Donbass land swap, although it wasn't really clear what would be swapped in return. How strategically risky would that be for Ukraine to lose that final bit in the sort of northern region of the Donbass?
I mean, I think it'd be very risky. I think that's why the Russians proposed it, because they know that the Ukrainians are very unlikely to go for it. So never mind the kind of the somewhat offensive idea of a swap, where what's being swapped is all Ukrainian territory. So the Ukrainians are being told, would you like some of your territory back at the cost of others? Not a great deal for them. But what we've got, particularly in Donetsk, is an area which, first of all, had a population pre-war of up to 400,000, rough estimate. Those are people who are probably not going to want to live under Russia. They would be internally displaced. Those cities form a kind of fortress belt, and that sits on slightly higher ground, slightly different terrain. It's very heavily fortified. The Ukrainians would be giving up extensive fortifications and defenses in urban areas that they have built into, redoubts, and they could start again, or they could expand their second line of defenses. But that would be an enormous effort, leaving them in a much weaker position. I know there is some very good analysis that suggests the Russians are actually trying to bypass them rather than go through them. And it's worth noting that's what's happening around Pokrovsk. So the Russians are pounding Pokrovsk, but they're not really entering it. They're now trying to extend around it to cut it off and threaten Ukrainian logistics. So the Russians are moving forward tremendously slowly. It's not certain they're trying to drive straight through Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, but they are trying to go round the edges and really ramp up the pressure on them, because they know that would be a pretty bad loss in terms of Ukrainian efforts and the future of the conflict.
And just finally, Matthew, meanwhile, the Russian-Belarus joint drills known as Zapad are scheduled to happen again in September. These drills were originally used in part as a cover for the original invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. They were cancelled in 2023. There are now already more Russian troops in Belarus for the drills this year. Should Ukraine be concerned about that? And for that matter, should other nations in the Baltics and Poland be
I think
watching these drills?
I mean, it's genuinely difficult to know on that score, because, in truth, the Russians don't. I mean, the idea that they would need the cover of an exercise to launch additional operations is, we're kind of well past that. Zapad has often been essentially a cosmetic it's a promotional exercise. I think a lot of people used to look at Zapad and the scale was impressive, but then we saw that didn't translate into tactical excellence or professionalism in the initial invasion. That doesn't mean it should be ignored. It's always possible that it will be used to move other forces around. But I think, in truth, the Ukrainians will be looking out for Russian attempts to put pressure on elsewhere, regardless of whether or not Zapad was going on. So, in many respects, the audience for Zapad is more domestic. The Russians will claim that they can still do this, and they're not tying up as many forces as they actually are. And I think the Ukrainians will be looking out for surprises or other activity that the Russians are trying to conduct to press home their advantage, such as it is.
Well, Matthew Savill, the Director of Military Sciences at the think tank RUSI, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.